Through the Desert by Henryk Sienkiewicz. Thanks to your subscription, the channel can grow. Chapter 29. They passed anxious days awaiting the return of the fever, but the second attack did not appear for a week, and though it was not so violent as the previous one, Nell felt much weaker after it. She had become so thin and had lost so much weight that she did not look like a girl, but rather like the ghost of a girl. The little flame of her life flickered so feebly that it seemed as if a breath would blow it out. Staś realized that death would not have to wait for a third attack to carry her off, and he expected her death from day to day, even from hour to hour. He, too, had become quite thin and dark, for these misfortunes were more than his bodily and mental strength could stand. Each day as he looked into Nell's face, he often said to himself, "My reward for having cherished her as the apple of my eye will be the privilege of burying her in the jungle." Why it should have come to this, he could not imagine. At times he reproached himself for not having taken sufficient care of her, and for not having treated her as kindly as he should, and then he felt such a pain in his heart that he could have bitten his fingers for grief. This misfortune was overwhelming. Nell now slept almost continually, which perhaps saved her life. But Staś awakened her several times during the day to give her some strengthening food. Whenever it was not raining, she would beg him to carry her out into the open air, for she was unable to stand. It often happened that she went to sleep even as he carried her in his arms. She knew that she was very ill, and that she might die at any time. At first, when she was a little better and felt inclined, she would talk about it to Staś, all the time crying, for she was afraid of death. "I shall never return to Papa," she once said. "But you must tell him that the thought of it made me very sorry, and ask him to come here to me." "You will return," answered Staś, but he was unable to say any more, for he wanted to cry, and Nell continued in a scarcely audible and sleepy voice, "And Papa will come here, and you will come back here again too, won't you?" At this thought a smile lit up her tiny wan face, and then she whispered still more softly, "But I am so sorry." At the same time she leaned her little head on his shoulder and began to cry, but he, conquering his own emotion, pressed her to his heart and answered quickly, "Nell, without you I shall not return, and in fact I don't even know what I should do without you." Both became silent, and Nell fell asleep again. Staś carried her back to the tree, but hardly had he stepped out of the dwelling than Kali came running down from the highest point of the neck of land, gesticulating with his hands and crying out in an excited and terrified voice, "Great man, great man!" "What do you want?" asked Staś, and the Negro extended his hand, pointing to the south, and cried, "Smoke!" Shading his eyes with the hollow of his hand, Staś gazed attentively in the direction indicated, the red light of the setting sun enabling him to see a column of smoke ascending in the midst of the jungle between the peaks of two rather high hills. Kali trembled from head to foot, for he still had a vivid recollection of their capture by the dervishes, and he felt sure that the smoke came from their camp. At last Staś also thought that it must come from Smain's camp, and so for a moment he was as much frightened as Kali. This was the climax. To have, in addition to Nell's deadly illness, the dervishes come upon them, to be taken prisoners again, and carried back to Fashoda or Khartoum in the hands of the Mahdi, or under Abdullah's whip. If they should be captured, Nell would doubtless die the very first day, and he would be a slave for life. For even if he were to escape, what was life, what was freedom without Nell? How could he look into the eyes of his father or Mr. Rawlison if the dervishes were to throw Nell's body to the hyenas and he could not tell where her grave was? Such thoughts shot through his head like lightning. Suddenly he felt an uncontrollable desire to look at Nell, and he went toward the tree. On the way he ordered Kali to put out the fire, and forbade him building it during the night. Then he entered the tree. Nell was not asleep. She felt better, as she immediately told Staś. Saba lay at her side and warmed her with his enormous body. She softly stroked his head and smiled when he tried to catch the little grains of mold that were flying about in the streak of light which the last rays of the setting sun threw into the hollow of the tree. She was evidently in a more cheerful mood than usual, for a little later she turned to Staś quite pleased and said, Perhaps I may not die after all." "You certainly will not die," answered Staś, "for as you feel stronger after the second attack, you will never have a third." And she began blinking as if trying to recollect something, and then said, "If I only had another little bitter powder, like the one that did me so much good the night after the lion visited us. You remember, don't you? Then I should not even think of dying, not even so much." And with one of her little fingers she indicated how little she would be prepared for death in such a case. "Ah!" cried Staś excitedly. "What would I not give for a grain of quinine? I don't know what." And he thought to himself that if he had enough quinine, he would not hesitate to give Nell 2 little powders at once, then wrap her up in the shawl, place her on his horse, and go off immediately in the opposite direction from the camp of the dervishes. Meanwhile the sun had gone down suddenly, and the jungle was in darkness. The girl talked for nearly half an hour, and then went to sleep, and Staś continued to think about the dervishes and the quinine. Although tortured by sorrow and fright, his extraordinarily clever brain began to build more and more daring plans. In the first place, he thought whether or not this smoke seen in the south was bound to come from Smain's camp. It certainly might come from the dervishes' camp, but also from an encampment of Arabians, who penetrate the interior of the continent in search of ivory and slaves. These Arabs were in no wise connected with the dervishes, who ruined their trade. It might also be a camp of Abyssinians, or some Negro village in the mountains, into which the hunters after human beings had not yet penetrated. Would it not be more sensible to find out what it really was? The Arabians of Zanzibar, from the districts of Bagamoyo, Witu, and Mombasa, and the seashore, continually came in contact with the whites, and who could tell if the offer of a large reward would not induce them to conduct Staś and Nell to one of the nearest seaports. Staś knew quite well that he could promise them such a reward, and that they would believe his word. But another thought caused him great uneasiness, for he noticed that the dervishes, especially those from Nubia, were almost as susceptible to fever in Khartoum as the whites, and that they cured themselves with quinine, stealing it from the Europeans, or if the renegade Greeks or Copts had any secreted, they bought it at a great price. And so it was probable that the Arabians from the borders of the ocean would certainly have some of it. "I will go there," said Staś to himself. "For Nell's sake, I will go there." On thinking the matter over more carefully, he came to the conclusion that even if they should prove to be Smain's party, he would have to go there. It occurred to him that, owing to the complete rupture between Egypt and Sudan, Smain might not have heard that they had been carried away from Fayoum. Fatima did not like Smain, and so the kidnapping must have been a plan of her own, which had been executed with the aid of Chamis, the son of Chadigi, and also of Idris, Geber, and the Bedouins. Now Smain was not at all interested in any of these people, for the simple reason that Chamis was the only one of them that he knew, and he had never seen or heard of the others. He was only interested in his own children and Fatima. Perhaps he longed as much for them as they did for him, and would be glad to be able to return to them, especially if he were tired of being in the service of the Mahdi. He surely had not won a great prize while with them, for instead of being placed in command of a large army, or made ruler over a wide extent of territory, he was obliged to go, heaven knows how far back of Fashoda, to capture slaves. "I shall say to him," thought Staś, "if you will lead us to some harbor on the Indian Ocean and return with us to Egypt, the government will forgive you everything, and you will be able to rejoin your children and Fatima, besides which Mr. Rawlison will make you a rich man. If not, you will never see your children or Fatima again." He was certain that Smain would think well of it, and that he would scarcely refuse such an offer. Of course, this was only a surmise. In fact, while an investigation might prove their destruction, it might also prove their deliverance, and the only means of help in this African wilderness. Staś felt surprised at himself for being terror-stricken at first at the thought of meeting Smain, but as it was necessary to procure assistance for Nell as soon as possible, he decided to go there that very night. This was easier said than done. It is one thing to sit at evening before a fire in the jungle, behind a hedge of thorns, and another to penetrate the dense darkness and wade through the high grass, in which lions, panthers, and leopards, not to mention hyenas and jackals, prowl at this time of night. But the boy remembered what the young Negro said the time when he went off one night in search of Saba and brought him back. Kali is afraid, but he goes. And he repeated to himself, I may be afraid, but I will go. As the night was very dark, he waited until the moon rose, and when its light shone out over the jungle, he called Kali and said, Kali, put Saba inside the tree and block up the opening with thorns. You and Mia must guard the little lady as the apple of your eye while I go to see what kind of people are over there in that camp. Great man, take Kali with him, and also the rifle which kills wild beasts. Kali not stay behind. You will remain, said Staś with decision. I forbid you to follow me. He now paused a while, and then continued in a rather hoarse voice. Kali, you are faithful and smart, and I hope that you will do what I tell you. Should I not return, and should the little lady die, you must leave her in the tree. But round it you must erect a high hedge, and carve a mark like this in the bark. And picking up 2 bamboo sticks, he placed them together like a cross, and continued, And should I not return, and should Bibi not die, then you must serve her faithfully and respectfully, and you must lead her to your people, and tell the Wahima warriors to take her due east until the great ocean is reached. There you will find white people, who will give you weapons, gunpowder, glass beads, wire, and as much canvas as you can possibly carry. Do you understand? But the young Negro knelt before him, clasped him round the knees, and sorrowfully pleaded with him, repeating, Oh, Bwana Kubwa, return, return, return! Staś was touched by the attachment of the black boy, and leaning down he placed his hand on his head and said, Kali, go to the tree, and God bless you. As he stood there alone, he thought about taking the donkey with him. It would certainly be safe to do so, for the lions in Africa, just as the tigers in India, on meeting a man riding, always attack the animal and not the man. But the question then presented itself that if the donkey were killed, who would carry Nell's tent, and on what would she ride? When he thought of these contingencies, he completely gave up the idea of taking the animal along, and began making his way through the jungle on foot. The moon was already fairly high in the heavens, and it was now much lighter. But the boy's troubles began at once, for he disappeared in the grass, which had grown so high that horse and rider could easily have hidden in it. Even in the daytime, it was not possible to see a foot ahead, so one can imagine what it was by night, when the moonlight only shone over the surface, and lower down everything was bathed in utter darkness. Under such conditions, it was easy to lose one's way and travel in a circle instead of advancing. But Staś took courage when he thought, in the first place, that the camp to which he was traveling could be at the most only 3 or 4 English miles away from the neck of land, and secondly, that the smoke had appeared between the peaks of 2 high hills, so by keeping the 2 hills in view, he could not get lost. But the grasses, mimosas, and acacias concealed everything. Fortunately, groups of ant hills, sometimes more than 10 feet high, appeared here and there. Staś carefully laid aside his gun when he came to each cluster of hills, and then he climbed to the top, and on seeing the hilltops outlined against the background of the dark sky, he climbed down again and continued his journey. When he thought of what would happen if the sky should become overcast and the moon no longer shine, he was very much frightened. But that was not the only danger. In the dead silence of the night in the jungle, every noise, every step, and almost every sound made by the insects as they creep through the grass can be heard. The sensation that comes over one is gruesome, and Staś was terrified. He had to take precautions against all sorts of catastrophes. He was obliged to listen attentively, to keep watch on all sides, and to hold his head ready to turn round like a screw, and his rifle ready to shoot. Every minute it seemed as though some animal was lying in ambush or was creeping up near him. From time to time he heard the grasses trembling and the tramping of animals running away. Then he thought that he must have frightened off the antelopes, for although one of their number always keeps watch, they sleep very lightly, knowing full well that amateur huntsmen do not go out hunting in the dark at this time of night. But now he sees something dark, large, under an umbrella acacia. It may be a rock, a rhinoceros, or a buffalo, which on scenting a human being will awaken and immediately advance to attack him, and he also sees two glittering things behind a black stone. Ha! Rifle to shoulder. That's a lion! No! False alarm. They are fireflies, for a tiny light rises in the air and glides over the grass, like a shooting star slanting downward. Staś not only climbed the anthills to make sure that he was going in the right direction, but also to dry the cold perspiration which stood out on his forehead, to get his breath, and to wait until his heart should cease to palpitate. Besides, he was already so tired that he could hardly stand. But he walked on, feeling that nothing must be left undone to save Nell. After 2 hours he came to a very stony place, where the grass was lower, and so it was much lighter. The two peaks looked as far off as ever, but a little nearer there were some rocks running irregularly in a transverse direction, above which towered a taller rock, and they apparently encased a kind of valley or gorge, resembling the one in which King had been imprisoned. Now on the side of the cliff, about 300 or 400 feet distant, he perceived the bright reflection of a flame. He stood still. His heart was again beating so wildly that in the silence of the night he could hear it thump. Whom is he likely to encounter down there? Arabians from the eastern coast? Smain's dervishes? Or savage Negroes who have left their native villages and, fleeing from the dervishes, have taken refuge in the most impenetrable forest of the mountains? Will he there find death or imprisonment, or perhaps help for Nell? It was impossible for him to turn back now, and besides, he had no inclination to do so. He crept slowly toward the fire, stepping as lightly as possible and holding his breath. After he had gone about 100 steps, he suddenly heard the neighing of horses in the jungle, and he stood still. By the light of the moon he counted 5. The dervishes would have had more, so he supposed that the others were probably hidden in the tall grass. But he was surprised that no one was watching them, or that at least a fire had not been left burning in order to frighten off the wild beasts. He thanked God that things were as they were, for he could now advance without attracting attention. The light of the fire on the cliff became still plainer. In less than a quarter of an hour, Staś reached a place where the cliff opposite him was brilliantly lighted, which satisfied him that a fire must be burning directly below it. Crawling on all fours, he crept carefully up to the side and looked down. The first object that attracted his attention was a large white tent. Before the tent stood a canvas camp bed, and on it lay a person wearing white European clothes. A small Negro, apparently about 12 years old, was throwing dry wood into the fire, which illuminated the side of the cliff, and a row of Negroes were sleeping on either side of the tent. The next moment, Staś slid down the slope into the bottom of the gorge. Illustration: on a canvas campstead lay a person wearing white European clothes. A row of Negroes were sleeping on either side of the tent.
Remember to subscribe.